All right, hey everyone. So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that one of you specifically requested. And it's something that I think is super important to all of us, especially those of us with kids in school or who, just really care about education in general. It's about how schools go about choosing the different programs that they implement and, why it seems like some of them, well, honestly, they kind of fizzle out. And this listener was also really interested in how all of this is connected to teacher morale.
Yeah.
So, to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be taking a look at this really insightful blog post by Dr. Howie Knoff. He's from Project Achieve. And we've also got a few other great resources that we're going to be weaving into our conversation today. And our mission today is to kind of equip you to be a bit of an educational detective yourself. So you can start to spot those programs that have maybe, warning signs or potential pitfalls, and to really see the link between, how teachers are feeling and how well a school is actually doing.
Oh, I love that. An educational detective. I'm ready. I'm ready to put on my my magnifying glass. Yeah. Because it is so important, like you said, what's going on in the classroom really does have this like ripple effect that impacts everything, not just the students.
Exactly. And Dr. Knopf shares this anecdote in his post that I think really illustrates this perfectly. He talks about a conversation he had with these developers who were like over the moon about this online game they had created to teach social skills. And, kids were just glued to it, spending hours on this platform. And they were even like, reporting back that they felt like they were being more cooperative with their classmates. So on the surface, it sounds like, wow, what a success story.
Yeah, it's really easy to get swept up in all that initial excitement,
Yeah.
especially when you see, that level of engagement. But Dr. Knopf, he points out that there's this real danger in mistaking um, enthusiasm for effectiveness, right?
Mm.
Like, if you really think about it, they never actually measured the students' social skills before they introduced the game. So how do we know if it was the game that actually made the difference? I mean, what if those kids were already, pretty socially adept?
It's like, the supplement commercials that promise, like, all these amazing results, but they don't tell you they only tested it on people who are already, like, incredibly healthy.
Exactly. It's the placebo effect in action. And then on top of that, you've got to consider, like, the social desirability bias is kids are smart. They might be saying they're feeling more cooperative because they think that's what the adults want to hear.
Oh, for sure. So imagine, right, like you see this brand new shiny program being rolled out at your kid's school. It's got all the bells and whistles. Everyone's talking about it. But without that solid evidence, you really have no idea if it's actually making a difference or if it's just, the latest fad.
And that's the thing, right? Dr. Knopf, he makes this point that failed programs have a real cost. And it's not just about, wasted resources like the time, the money, the energy, but it's also, it's also the risk of potentially making the original problem even worse.
He uses this really powerful phrase in his post. He says, every time you do an intervention with a struggling student that doesn't work, you potentially make the student more resistant to the next intervention. And I would say that probably applies to teachers too. I mean, it's got to be super demoralizing as a teacher to pour your heart and soul into something that ends up not delivering.
Or absolutely, it creates this, like this cycle of cynicism
Yeah.
where everyone's just kind of like, oof, here we go again, another program that's going to fail.
Yeah.
And, that resistance to change is like a huge obstacle to creating a really, a dynamic and a responsive learning environment.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Which brings us to this key point that was raised in an EdSurge article that you shared with me. It's about the limitations of using randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, as like the only way to measure how effective a program is, especially when it comes to education. Now, RCTs, they're considered like the gold standard in a lot of fields, especially in medicine. You have your control group, you have your experimental group, you try to carefully control all the variables.
Uh-huh. And that approach works great when you're testing something, like a new drug.
Mm.
But education, well, it's not exactly a controlled laboratory environment, is it? We're dealing with these complex human beings,
Mhm.
and they all have their own unique experiences and learning styles and, different challenges that they're facing. And what works brilliantly in one classroom might totally flop in another.
Yeah, it's like expecting the same exact recipe to produce, identical cakes, regardless of what kind of oven you're using, or the altitude, or even like what brand of flour you use. There are just so many variables at play in a real world setting, especially in education.
Precisely. And trying to, like, isolate the active ingredients of a successful program in education, Well, it's a lot more challenging than, say, identifying the, specific chemical compound that makes a drug effective. And then you also have to think about the ethical considerations. Like in education, can we really justify withholding a program that could potentially be beneficial from a control group of students?
That's such an important point. So it seems like evaluating educational programs really requires a more nuanced approach than just relying on those RCTs.
Exactly. So, I mean, if RCTs aren't like the be-all and end-all, then how do we gain a deeper understanding of what's actually working or not working in our schools?
Well, that's where this Education Week teacher survey comes in. It offers some really valuable insights, I think, from, the folks who are right there on the front lines of education every day.
This survey, it really highlights the need for like that nuanced perspective that we were just talking about. Because, I mean, while it doesn't try to like pinpoint specific causes for anything, it does give us a pretty clear picture of how teachers are feeling right now.
And it's not exactly a happy picture, is it? I know we talked about that little blip of increased job satisfaction we saw, but sadly, it seems like that was pretty short-lived.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's right. This latest survey shows that only 18% of public school teachers say they're very satisfied with their jobs.
Yeah.
And gosh, when you compare that to numbers from, even just a few decades ago, well, it's a pretty dramatic difference.
It's alarming. And it looks like the survey also revealed some pretty some concerning trends when it comes to teacher stress and burnout.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of teachers are saying that they're feeling, really overwhelmed by student behavioral challenges and that they're not getting enough support, especially when it comes to, their own mental health needs.
Makes you wonder if those two things are connected, right?
Uh,
I mean, could it be that the increase in student behavioral issues is like directly contributing to teacher burnout?
It's definitely, I mean, it's a question worth exploring for
Yeah.
sure. But it's important to remember that the survey itself doesn't, really dig into the why behind any of this. Like it highlights these areas of concern, but it doesn't really attempt to pinpoint, what the root causes are.
So, I mean, even though it might be tempting to just like read a headline that says, teachers want more support with student discipline, and then just immediately assume, okay, we need a new discipline program. Well, it might not be that straightforward, right?
Exactly. And this goes back to what Dr. Knopf was saying about being an educational detective. We can't just jump to those knee-jerk reactions. We have to like really dig a little deeper and try to understand, all the different factors that might be at play here.
Because just because two things happen together doesn't mean that one is causing the other, right? Like,
Right.
there could be a whole bunch of like underlying issues that, that we're not even seeing.
Exactly. And think about it this way. You mentioned earlier how important it is to gather evidence when you're evaluating a program. Well, the same principle applies here, right? We need to be gathering evidence to try to understand the root causes of these challenges before we start, trying to throw solutions out.
So how can we actually put that, that whole educational detective mindset into practice when it comes to something like teacher morale? I mean, where do we even begin?
Well, just like with evaluating a program, the first step is to clearly define the problem.
Yeah.
In this case, we're talking about low teacher morale, but what does that actually look like? I mean, how is it actually showing up in the school? Is it, is it increased absenteeism or maybe really high turnover rates? Or, have teachers just stopped collaborating with each other?
So we need to get specific. We can't just say, oh, morale is low. We
Mhm.
need to actually paint a really detailed picture of what that's actually looking like in the school environment.
Exactly. And then, once you've done that, then you can move on to gathering data from all different sources. And don't just rely on, on surveys. You've got to actually talk to teachers directly, maybe do some focus groups or observe what's happening in classrooms, analyze student data, take a look at school policies. I mean, the more data points you have, the better your understanding is going to be.
Okay, so define the problem, gather the data. What's the next step in our educational detective investigation?
Well, now it's time to do some analysis. We got to sift through all that information we've gathered and look for, for patterns, connections, and possible root causes. Are teachers feeling, I don't know, maybe micromanaged? Are they not getting enough opportunities for professional development? Do they feel disconnected from, I don't know, maybe the school's mission? Or
That's like trying to put a puzzle together, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Each piece of data gives you a little bit more insight into the big picture.
Exactly. And once you've identified some of those potential root causes, well then and only then do you start to think about possible solutions.
And the solutions should be, really targeted and focused on directly addressing those underlying issues, right? Not just like, random initiatives that sound good but aren't actually connected to the real problems.
Exactly. Like, if teachers are feeling totally overwhelmed by student behavioral issues,
Mhm.
maybe the answer isn't, another new discipline program. Maybe it's about, I don't know, providing more support for students' social and emotional needs. Or maybe it's about giving teachers more training in, in specific classroom management techniques.
So it's about looking at the whole picture. It just seems like this whole conversation has really been about like changing how we think about all of this. Instead of looking at teachers as just the people who, have to carry out whatever program someone else came up with, we need to start seeing them as real partners in this whole process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, teachers are the ones, who are actually in the classrooms day in and day out interacting with students. They have so much valuable insight into, what's working, what isn't, and what students really need. Yeah.
And going back to what Dr. Knopf was saying about, every failed intervention making students more resistant to the next one, I think that's true for teachers too. Like every time a program doesn't work out, it kind of chips away at their sense of, I don't know, like their belief that they can actually make a difference.
That's a really good point. It really highlights like how important it is to involve teachers in every single step of the process.
Hmm.
From figuring out what the problem is to actually coming up with solutions and figuring out how to put them into practice. When teachers feel like they're being heard and that their opinions matter and that they have some ownership over the changes that are happening, well, they're just way more likely to be invested in making sure those changes actually work.
It makes me think back to that EdSurge article we talked about earlier, the one about the limits of using RCTs when we're talking about education. And the article talked about how, it's just really difficult to isolate different variables in a real classroom setting. But I mean, isn't that like that complexity? Isn't that part of what makes teaching so challenging? And well, and so rewarding too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
And that's exactly why just relying on, on numbers like test scores or the results of an RCT can give you a really, really limited view of what's actually happening. We need to be paying attention to the qualitative stuff too, like the stories, the observations, all the insights that come from the people who are like, actually living this every day.
So for anyone listening out there, here are a few things to keep in mind as you're, trying to make sense of all the different educational programs and new initiatives out there. First of all, don't just get, swept away by flashy marketing or the latest buzzwords. Ask the tough questions.
Yeah, like what evidence is there to actually back this program up? How is it evaluated? And most importantly, does it really address the needs of the students and the teachers in this specific context?
And remember, programs that don't work, they have a real ripple effect. They can waste a lot of time and money and energy, and they can actually make existing problems even worse. And they can really damage, the trust that people have in the whole system.
Which is why it's so important to, to protect and to really nurture teacher morale.
Hmm.
Because when teachers feel supported and valued and like they actually have some control over things, well, everyone benefits.
It's not about finding that, that magic bullet solution or that one program that's suddenly going to fix everything. It's about creating a culture of like continuous improvement where everyone is always reflecting and learning and adapting. And that's what being an educational detective is all about.
Right. Gather your data. Really analyze it, figure out what the root causes are, and then work to develop solutions that are, that are targeted and sustainable and that are actually tailored to the unique needs of that particular school community.
We really hope this deep dive has given you, the tools and the motivation to be an active, informed participant in shaping the educational landscape, in your own community.
Yeah, remember, the future of education really depends on all of us being thoughtfully engaged and not just blindly accepting whatever the latest fad is.
So the next time you hear about a new program or, a new initiative at your school, put on your educational detective hat. Ask those critical questions. Because at the end of the day, it's about creating learning environments that are not only effective, but that are also joyful, equitable, and empowering for absolutely everyone.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive, but keep those educational detective hats handy, folks, and keep learning.